Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to gather. We have a lot of attendees today with the topic being of great interest. And so we're just going to allow people some time to gather before we get our program going. Welcome, everybody. We're just giving everybody just a couple more minutes to gather. Thanks for being with us tonight. What do you think, Alyssa? I know we still have people joining. Do you think we should get going?
Let's go ahead and get started so we have time for everything. Thank you, Samantha.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, we have a wonderful group and more people joining us, but we'll get going in the interest of time. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. On behalf of BID Needham, SPAN, and High Rock Pollard PTC, we're really happy to bring, as a team, to you this conversation about navigating screen time and technology, especially during COVID-19. And we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Jill Walsh, who will be covering that very timely topic. Just a few Zoom rules before we get going. This will be recorded and will be available to participants after the fact. And please, if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself, that would be great, and cut down on feedback. We will have time for questions and answers from about 8 o'clock till 8:30. And so please either put your questions in the chat or wait until we get to that period of time. And the chat will be monitored, and we'll have folks that from our team presenting those questions to Dr. Walsh. My name is Samantha Trotman Berman, and I'm actually fortunate enough to be chair of the BID Needham Board of Advisors. And one of the reasons I'm particularly excited this evening for this presentation, we've actually from time to time done some speaker series through BID Needham, and they're on important health and community related topics. And they're always quite well attended, but part of our purpose there is to get information out there into the community, but also be partners with the community in things that are really important. And so what's really exciting about tonight is that, as I said, this is presented in partnership with SPAN, which we will hear more about in the comments later on, and also with the local middle school and Pollard Middle School in Needham. And so that partnership has not only meant that I think we have a terrific topic this evening, but we also have close to 300 participants signed up. So I think that's very telling. At the hospital, we have certainly seen the immediate impact of COVID-19. And our children and all of us in the community are obviously feeling the repercussions of the pandemic. So it's very clear that we need to work together to address mental health issues and general well-being in these times. I've had some friends say to me, if you didn't understand mental health issues before COVID, you certainly do now. And I think that's true. Technology is always a fine balance, I found in my household with 4 young children. And again, with the isolation that we're suffering, with the need to do a lot of socializing and also schoolwork online, that's become even a trickier balance. So with that, we are very excited to hear Dr. Walsh and all that she has to say. I did want to make a special introduction to Tamatha Bibo, who's the principal of Pollard Middle School, Jessica Downey, who's the principal of High Rock Middle School, Bala Muthu Karupun, who is the president of High Rock Pollard PTC, Karen Shannon, who's the director of SPAN, and Kathy Coulthart, SPAN Parent Action Team member and social worker with Needham Youth and Family Services. So we have a terrific group here representing this partnership, and obviously a lot that we can accomplish this evening, but also ongoing in the community. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha. As Samantha mentioned, our children are going through unprecedented times with not being in school full time, having limits on social gatherings and activities, and being on technology and screens more than ever. As a therapist and parent, I'm grateful that Jill is here tonight to talk about this important topic. Dr. Jill Walsh is a sociology professor at Boston University. She is also the founder of Digital Aged, a consulting group that educates students, families, and educational institutions about positive technology use. She earned her PhD in sociology from Boston University, a master's in public policy from Brown University, and her BA from Harvard University. Her research looks at the way digital media use impacts adolescents' well-being and psychosocial development. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jill Walsh.
Thank you so much. I was sort of giggling to myself as you were doing the introduction, thinking, and all that, and here I am in my closet, and presenting to you all tonight. So anyway, hopefully with all that schooling, I still, am still in my attic. All right, so what I want to talk to you all about tonight is sort of start some key conversations about, the thing that I'm sure is on most of your minds. The first thing I really want to focus on is this new experience of pandemic challenges adding to our tech rules. And really thinking about, we have these ideas of what rules we should have. And I'm sort of giggling, right? Because it was hard enough without the pandemic. And now you add in the pandemic and it's like, what do I even do? Right. So I kind of want to give you a sense from my perspective. And I spend time every week, unfortunately this year, on Zoom, talking to kids, talking to schools about what's working and what's not. And so I want to sort of situate what I'm hearing from kids with also in the context of the research, right? And where we can relax, right? Where we can sort of feel like, okay, pandemic times, it is different, right? And then I kind of thought, given that we're all stuck in our homes so very much these days, and we have a lot of time where we don't have anything to say to one another, right? As kids tell me all the time, I have nothing to say to anyone. I haven't done anything. I thought, this might be a great opportunity to mention some key topics, things that I think are worth talking about now. They may feel very far away to you when you think about your children, and I'm not, please know, not saying this in a you should be panicked, you should be worried, but kind of I think of these topics as I think of fire drills, and sort of like we teach kids how to prepare for a fire and we hope they never have to use those skills. And that's sort of what I want to give you tonight is sort of some guidelines for some really important conversations, particularly some of the work I was doing leading right up to the pandemic around some important themes that I really want to make sure families are talking about. And I figure we have the time now, right? So why not do it? Okay. So the pandemic realities of technology, we all are on way more screens than we ever envisioned, right? That is just our reality. The other thing that kids tell me across the board is that the tech space is the one place that they can see and connect with their friends that actually feels normal. In other words, the group text hasn't changed. Like from before the pandemic to now, I still function in the group text the same way. If I play video games, like that space is sort of the same. Absolutely, the social stuff ebbs and flows, and I'll talk about that. But the key thing is the tech itself feels normal. The other thing they tell me, and I think this is probably true of a lot of adults too, if we're honest, that this year is really hard, right? I don't need to tell you that. And we are using technology more and more to take a break from the hard experiences, from the hard feelings. Like someone who's like, hockey season gets derailed by COVID. And it's sort of like, I feel miserable, I feel yucky, and I go to my phone, right? Some people have, when they're looking at current events and they can't stop looking, right? We call that doom scrolling, right? It's like, what happened now? What happened now, right? And we get ourselves caught up in these things. And what we're kind of doing there is we're trying to just take a break, right? We call it mood management. And that is happening. That always happened. Like we always did that, but now it is heightened. So it's hard feelings and also boredom, right? I know everybody's busy. I know everybody has a lot to do, but every day feels like Groundhog's Day, right? It's like this again, another day at home, another day doing this, right? And so even if you have things to do, it still feels incredibly boring. And tech is often a distraction from that. So this is sort of our reality. So what can we do to help? Okay. So the first thing is around this topic, which is loaded from the day your child got access to any technology. I'm sure it's one of the top things you've thought about at home, right? So the first thing I want to suggest for any of these topics, whether it's the fire drills later on or just this like screen time question, the approach that works best is connecting first and thinking about changing or suggesting second. So a lot of us, right, we are super fed up with Snapchat or whatever it is. We think it's stupid and a waste of time. And we launch right into our lecture on why Snapchat is awful, right? And actually, I think right now, connected to the second bullet point, the more we can do to validate and empathize with how hard this is, right? And then offer a suggestion. So conversations I'm having at home with my 13-year-old might sound like, buddy, I know this is so hard right now, and I'm so sorry you're going through this, but I'm seeing that there's a lot of time on YouTube, and it feels to me like you're doing that instead of maybe getting some exercise or, whatever it is, the thing that you want to change. But first acknowledging this, how hard this is, and validating that experience for them is incredibly important. We might be hearing them say, they might be sobbing in the kitchen that so-and-so didn't reply to their text message. And I'm sure there's many of us, I am guilty of this as well, of thinking, in your head going, do you realize there's a global pandemic? There are so many really big deal things going on right now. You're worried about your text message. Yes, they are, right? Developmentally, that is appropriate, right? They are the most selfish that they will be in middle school, unfortunately. They're also sometimes the most awesome they can be, right? It truly runs the gamut. But the thing to remember is you are their person, right? You are the person they can tell their troubles to and that they want to connect with around this. And sometimes because we sort of brush it off with, well, you shouldn't worry about that, or you shouldn't care about how many likes you got on Instagram, or this thing is stupid anyway. They feel like they haven't been validated. And that's important in general in terms of relationship building, but it's also important in terms of technology, because then when things go really wrong, they tend not to reach out to us because they feel like they got shot down along the way. And so then when things are hard, they keep to themselves about it, or they go to a friend, right? And we really want to create the situation where they're coming to us. Connected to all this is this framework that I really like thinking about during the pandemic, is that we're working with our children, not on them, right? We're trying to help them. We're trying to coach them and suggest things, but it's not our project to change them, especially during a pandemic, right? And so I think if we can sort of take this framework of just being really empathetic, my understanding, and I believe this both on a personal level from my time with kids and also based on the work we know about adolescent development and conversation I'm having with other people who do this work, I don't want to rank who's having a harder time during the pandemic. That's wildly inappropriate. But I would say in terms of an age range, it might be hardest to be a middle schooler going through the pandemic, just based on what we know about where they are developmentally and the importance of trying to be independent for the first time, and the importance of friendships and how important that social circle is. When I'm talking to 17 and 18-year-olds, they're like, yeah, it stinks. It's awful. I'm missing so many important things. All of that is bad, but my friends are good. We're good. I already know all my people, right? And middle schoolers are in this swarm of like, what's going on? Are we friends? Are we not? I don't know what's going on. So we add all of those layers in to the development, and it's really hard. So I would say overall, we want to support their tech use because, as Samantha mentioned at the beginning, it is their way to connect with their friends, but we also need to set some boundaries, right? So what does that look like? The first thing I think, and I would have told you this in 2019 if I was talking to you pre-pandemic, but it certainly is true now, not all screen time is the same. We have been fed a narrative by pop culture that is 2 hours of screen time, after which time, they fall off a cliff and their brains start rotting and we've destroyed them and everything. That's really not true. And we can talk about how they ever got to the 2 hours a day of screen time anyway. But what we know for certain is that the quality of content matters as much, and many would say, if not more, than the quantity. And my colleague Jenny Radesky does great work on this if any of you are interested in looking more at it. But essentially the argument is, I could look at two kids who are on YouTube. One kid is watching videos just mindlessly upload and is spacing out. And the other kid has, created some content, like interviews a friend for like a sports show that they're creating at home, right? And that might constitute the same amount of time. And yet the quality of that experience is wildly different. So that would be true anyway. I would say right now, my version of quality, given the pandemic, is a little more elastic than it would normally be, right? So normally I would be saying, don't text each other, talk face to face, right? I would have said all those things. Now that might be harder to do, I'm okay with the texting a little bit more, right? So especially if it offers them a social opportunity, thinking about that as quality in a way we might not have, and also in a way we might not going forward, but for right now. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you have several children at home, quality experience on technology might look different depending on your kids, depending on how introverted or extroverted they are, depending on their friend group, their interests. So keeping all of that in mind, I think, is really important. So what do I think you should definitely focus on? And this is the COVID edition, right? First of all, you should do anything that works for you. If you have anything going on right now that is working, keep doing it. Even if I don't say anything about it tonight or anyone else does, please do it. The other things that are really important to me, enforcing healthy sleep patterns. We know for certain that there is a very clear direct link between sleep and mental health. That is not debatable. We also know for certain that technology use left unfettered amongst teenagers affects their sleep, right? They are using it all night. They're texting each other. They're looking at Snapchat. They're doing everything, right? And so it's really, really important that we do this. So many kids talk to me in the past year, especially maybe with later school starts or days at home, so they don't have to get up as early, of really interrupted sleep patterns where they're like napping for several hours a day. This was especially popular last spring and over the summer, and then staying up really late and like watching the entire, fourth season of The Office in one night, right? Keeping that kind of stuff in mind and really thinking about healthy sleep patterns. So obviously phones outside the room, at bedroom at night, all of that kind of stuff is critical. Rules that make it easier for you. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, I would recommend that if you haven't already, that you take an inventory of what your kids have access to, what apps they're using, what platforms, that kind of thing, and do a quick little research on each one. You might go to Common Sense Media, which is a great source for this, and just look at what are the typical pitfalls? Where are the places where kids get into challenges? So for example, TikTok, right? If we look at TikTok allows kids, if the setting isn't correct, like when you just load it and you don't change anything, it allows people to message your children directly, whether they're connected to them or not. Personally, if I'm looking at that as a parent, that's something I would want to remove. Now, how would you ever know that, right? If you didn't know anything about it and you're not a TikToker, like how would you know, right? Common Sense Media will tell you. And it will also tell you how to, what you should be looking for. If you can't figure it out, just Google, how do I change the messaging settings in TikTok, right? But Common Sense Media will at least direct you to the right places. So things that you don't have to be micromanaging, that you don't have to monitor, but keeping that in line. The other thing that's very, very important right now, especially because motivation is at an all-time low, like across the board, is the amount of multitasking that is going on. Kids who are perhaps on a Zoom class and also like secretly gaming under, I say secretly, but sometimes it's not so secret. It's like right up here. But it's homework that is 10 minutes of math and then 25 minutes of something else, like some tech thing, and then they're trying to go back. Multitasking, obviously, as we all know, doesn't work. But the other thing that's actually really important for this time is multitasking is actually very stressful on our brains. If I were to, I won't, but if I'm screen sharing, if I were to open up Chrome for you, you would see that I have about 47 tabs open on Chrome. And it's things I need to read, things I need to look at, things like, right, it's got to follow up. Okay. And every time I go on to Chrome, I'm like, oh gosh, they're all still there staring at me, right? And I actually have a little bit of a response. That is essentially, multitasking is essentially having 47 tabs open in your brain. I mean, it's like focus a little here and a little here and a little here. And actually that's quite stressful for your brain. So in a time when we're actually trying to minimize stress, the more we can do to help with multitasking. So what does that look like? Absolutely, they can access everything on any device. So it's never going to be perfect. But the more you can do to create an environment for success, the better. So not relying on self-control, right? Which is a thing that maybe sort of sometimes exists for some people somewhere, right? I actually take major issue with that term. Instead, I would think about environmental control, right? So making sure where they work is the hardest place to multitask, right? Making sure they don't have direct access to the phone right next to where they work. It's just too tempting. Right. I used to, because I sometimes get caught up in this back before COVID, I would go work at a coffee shop. Why would I do that? Because I'm not going to look at my Instagram and shop on Amazon and, do all that stuff while I'm in a coffee shop, right? Because I don't want people to see me do those things, right? So I work, right? That's me creating an environment that will limit my multitasking. So the more you can do, the better. And the other thing that's really important is that you enforce tech breaks. So if I get two things across to you, the first one being that quality matters as much as quantity. The second thing is when you think about quantity, think about how much in one sitting. Okay, so what we know for certain is even if they have to be on for 6 hours, the more they can do to get up, move around a little bit, take an eye break, like do some jumping jacks, whatever it is that they can do, making them run upstairs to get a snack, whatever it is that works, do that because they need to take breaks. They need to step away from this. And if they're doing it to socialize, that's awesome. That's great. But making sure they have breaks, whether it's to take a walk with the family dog, whether it's to have dinner, whatever, they need to step away from the screen. And so breaks are really, really important. If you decide you want to, tackle screen time, if you're feeling like you're really overwhelmed by it, I take the approach that my mentor always brings up, which is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So that's how we have to do this. You have to think about, you can't go to a middle schooler and say, we're, too much tech, we have to change everything, right? That will get, zero buy-in. Much easier to pick one thing, the thing that maybe creates the most challenge. And I would say the most challenge for your child, which might not be what you think challenging, but is the most challenging in terms of they're consistently upset when they're using it, or they have the hardest time stepping away from it, or they're always, like multitasking using this thing. Try to work on that one thing and really approach it as a problem you're trying to solve with them. Like, what else could we do? What do you think could help with this? And then always asking this alternative of, how can I help you? So that's our goal. We want to use less YouTube. How can I help you? Right. And then they're going to come up with some ideas. They may work, they may not, but you're going to try it out. The idea is to give them a little bit of a control in this, especially right now when they have no control over anything in their lives right now. Right. This is a period of heightened, like, disordered eating. We're seeing kids trying to manifest control in all sorts of ways. The more we can do to give them an opportunity to control this, to actually get a say in how this goes, the better. I will tell you, in my conversations from this fall and this winter, kids recognize this now. They know they're using it too much. They're saying to me, like, honestly, I'm actually even bored by my social media. Right. So this is a perfect opportunity. Get their buy-in and think it through, brainstorm ideas, try it out. And really, this approach of, how can I help you enforce that, creates a little bit more buy-in. And really, I'm emphasizing a little bit more buy-in, because there's no way that I'm going to suggest something and they're going to be like, oh my God, you're the best ever. Thank you for taking away my phone, right? That's never going to happen, right? They're still going to be upset. They're still going to hate us and tell us we're the worst and all those things. But you'll have a little bit more of an opportunity to tackle it, right? Just like as we think break up goals, right? Do the same thing with them. Help them see it. Help them see it over the course of a week. And giving them the chance, like recognizing that those mood management things really matter. And so maybe after a really tough week, Friday night can be 3 episodes of their favorite show, right? That's okay to do on a Friday night. It's just not okay to do 6 nights a week, right? Or maybe even 4 nights a week, right? Depending on where you stand. But thinking about it that way, and it can be really helpful. And also, just, you haven't ruined them, right? You have not ruined them. They are struggling. They're struggling a lot right now. I think we're all struggling, but kids are so shockingly resilient. They're concerned. They're concerned about socializing again. They're worried about all of that stuff, which we can talk about in the Q&A, how to help them through that. But the way that I saw them adapt to wearing masks was, quite frankly, so much better than I saw any adult manage it. Like, every adult I work with is like, this thing on my face, I can't handle it. And every kid's like, yeah, this is just what I have to do, right? They're just so much better at adapting. So I really think you don't have to worry about, they got so used to excessive amounts of screen time, they're going to expect excessive amounts of screen time. They are telling me across the board, I cannot wait to see people. I cannot wait. One even said to me today, I wish I could have recorded it for her poor mother. She said, my mother used to make me go on these lame, like, trips every weekend to go see some historical thing. And I hated it and complained. And I can't wait to go on one now. Right? Like, they actually are missing that stuff. So it's not for all time. It's for now. A couple of things I do want to focus on, though, around mental health. I would say that a couple things you want to look for are the 3 that I have listed here. And actually, I should add to it. So excessive rumination, we are seeing a lot of kids, particularly around their technology, because the tech allows them to continually look back at things. We're seeing a lot of kids doing a ton of ruminating, meaning they get a text, they don't really know how to interpret it because they haven't really seen the person a ton. And they start going, oh my God, does this person hate me? What else is going on? Does everyone hate me? I should look at every text and every Instagram post and every Snapchat that anyone ever sent me. And then they start going in this spiral of, oh my gosh, everyone hates me. I have no friends, right? And it just builds, right? And they're in a ruminating cycle. The really important thing about ruminating is that it feels like you're helping yourself. You kind of think like, I'll think about it more, but they're actually never coming to a resolution. They're never moving outside of the worry and the cycle. They're just sort of in that state. So if you're seeing that every once in a while, like that feels really normal right now. If you're seeing it all the time, that might be warranting a follow-up conversation. If the kids aren't ruminators, other kids might be externalizers. And those are the kids that want to just put it all on you, particularly maybe you. Maybe their friends a little bit, but mostly on you. And those are the kids like you might walk into the kitchen and be like, would you like a muffin? And they're like, why are you talking to me? Right? And they just start screaming out of the, what they're doing is they're putting their hard feelings on you. And that's another very common thing you might see. I talked about the upended sleep schedules and the lack of interest in other activities. What I mean by that is, if they actually had a chance to do the dorky things that I do to socialize, like take a walk with a friend, I recognize that's not their pick, but if they actually had a chance to do something safely like that, and they're opting not to. And again, not once in a while, but if they're continually opting not to, it might be worth thinking about further. What I will say just before I move on to mood management, because it connects to mental health, is that one of the things that I feel very strongly about, and I tell kids all the time, is I think we've been sold a false bill of goods in the pop culture narrative where we say things like, mental health is being happy and being super resilient and all these things. And actually, as my mentor, Lisa D'Amour, if any of you have read her books, they're amazing. But Lisa says so clearly and so just so thoughtfully that really what mental health is having the right emotion for the right context. Okay. And so what she means by that is if something is scary and hard, it's okay to feel scared. If something is sad, it's appropriate to feel sad, right? And this is a period of uncertainty and sadness, right, going on. What we worry about is when the emotional response doesn't match the moment. So if they're in pre-pandemic, if they were able to hang out with their 5 best friends and they're laughing, and all of a sudden one child's heart starts racing and they start to panic, right? That is a situation where the emotional response doesn't match the context, and that's worth a conversation. The other thing about this sadness and things like that is that, yes, it's actually, appropriate to have, but we do worry about sustained periods of sadness. So what I talk to kids about a lot and how you might think about it is I use the term emotional seesaw here. You might call it a roller coaster. It's okay to be up and down in the pandemic, but if we're always down, right, and we're consistently down, that feels different, okay? So mood management plays into all of this because we just don't like to be alone with our thoughts right now. And that's sort of like the 2020, 2021 feeling. And technology really does help us regulate our moods for better or worse. That was true pre-pandemic. Back in the old days, I used to have my students at BU go on the T and I would say they couldn't use their phone and they had to record how they felt about it. And they were like, it is so weird. I felt like the biggest weirdo. I was just staring at people, right? And, and then they'd be like, I had to think about stuff, like all this stuff, right? And we have done that before the pandemic, but we're definitely doing it now. So here's the thing about it. We tend not to use it to manage positive moods, right? We don't go, I'm having the best day ever. I'm going to scroll through Instagram for 3 hours, right? We do it with the yucky feelings or the boredom. And you know what? I feel like in the pandemic, in small doses, it's totally fine. Like my son and I have been watching The Office together and we do, an episode. And if it's, a really bad day, we might do 2 episodes. They're 23 minutes each. We do that. That's fine. What we don't want to do is compulsively do it, because what mood management is doing in that case is it's never giving us a break. First of all, it's never allowing us to be alone with our thoughts, which I actually think is incredibly important. One of the things that actually worried me, if you had asked me in like 2018, which feels so quaint now, but one of the things that actually kept me up at night was this question: was what is the implication for kids of never having opportunities to just self-reflect, right? I think back on being a teenager and just like being in my room, listening to music and thinking about like, I don't know, like, what am I doing? Do I actually really want to do this? Like having those really hard thoughts. And they start to have those and then they quickly are drawn to their phone. And kids are telling me this winter about, and I really don't mean this in an inappropriate way, but they're like, I'm finding that I'm taking my phone everywhere. Like I'm walking into the bathroom with my phone because the second I put it down, I actually have to think about stuff and I don't want to, right? So thinking that through and what we're missing. The other thing, of course, about this is it might be fine if we're watching an episode of The Office, but if I go on to Twitter or I go on to Instagram and I see something hard or something upsetting, then I'm in an even worse place. Right. So what I talk to kids about is sort of being tactical on it, and thinking about, what do you need as a tactical break? The last thing I would just say is thinking about the news and managing, hard news. Um, Emotions are for certain contagious, especially negative ones. We are wired to remember the hard things much longer than we remember the positive things, unfortunately. And that plays out quite intensely for kids on social media. So they could be scrolling through Instagram and they could see like 10 awesome things, lovely compliments, friends connecting, all that nice stuff. And then they see one thing that's upsetting. And if you ask them hours later what they saw, they will only remember the one hard thing. Right. We are wired to remember the hard and scary stuff. It made sense when we were, early humans. It's a little bit more challenging now. Right. So keeping that in mind, because the news is hard right now. Now, you might be thinking this quote that I really appreciated when I was talking to a group of parents this fall about this. And they were, someone raised their hand. They were like, I'm sorry, my kid is not reading the Washington Post over breakfast. Like, I really wish that was my problem. 100% I get you. I don't think they're doing that either. But what we have to be aware of is that they are absorbing news all the time from social media, from celebrities, from alerts when they just pick up their phone. They're getting access to this information, and helping them recognize when they've consumed too much, when it goes from like info gathering to just like a spiraling, upsetting kind of experience. Helping them understand that right now, helping them take breaks from it is really important. I talk to my kids about this. I found myself really doing this at the early stages of the pandemic. I would wake up and the first thing I would do is open my phone and look at like how many cases today and what was happening today, right? And I would start the day like this. And then, an hour into it, I was like, well, I better look again, right? And I would do that. Now, again, they might not be doing about the pandemic. They might be doing about racial injustice in this country. They might be doing about climate change, whatever, might be their topic for right now that they're thinking about. They're absorbing it in so many different ways, and we have to help them understand how to take breaks, and recognizing that would be really helpful. So just want to throw that out there. Okay, so before I open it up to questions, I do want to cover some of these, conversations you can have, as I said, while you're stuck inside together again. I feel like every day I'm singing that Adele song where I'm like, hello, it's me. You've missed me for so long. Okay, so first thing, right? And again, these are the tricky things, but these are the things that you want to have in the back of your mind. You want to be talking about and getting them ready so that they know what to do if they're ever in this situation. I am not saying they are in this situation every day. I think for most kids, the digital space actually goes pretty well or is neutral, right? But when the hard things happen, we need to be prepared, okay? So romantic partnerships, right? This is sort of getting into the sexting kind of stuff. The reality of this is that it ramps up very quickly in the digital space. Again, true before the pandemic, because kids are, they might be texting 20 times a day, right? They're not having 20 face-to-face conversations with somebody, right? But over the course of all that texting, things can become a little more intimate. They feel a little closer, right? And so it ramps up fast. It often doesn't match what's happening face-to-face. So especially in middle school, kids will say to me, we've actually never hung out one-on-one, but when we text, it feels like we're, partnered, right, in some way. That can be terribly confusing with them. Add into this the pandemic, where kids are feeling more insecure in general. And so we do see, at least with the college age population, which is the only one we have data on right now, we do see a rise in the college age group of sending sext. And it feels like most people are saying it's because they're kind of alone, they're kind of bored, they're kind of insecure, and they're doing things that they might not have done because they're sort of left to, they're in whatever. I'm not going to try. I spend too much time with college students. I am not going to try to guess their motivations for anything. Okay. But it is most often with people they know offline. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I think we get very concerned about stranger danger. It is definitely something to talk about. Please know I'm not minimizing that, but I do want to make sure you know that most of the time they at least vaguely know of the person. Okay, now that might not be enough for you, but it's not usually such a stranger. So when you're talking about this, first of all, I think in a perfect world, and I know this ship might have sailed, but in a perfect world, if anytime you're talking about sex, you're also talking about sexting, right? So anytime that conversation's coming up, and I get it, it's not a conversation you want to revisit 20 times, right? But if you can bring in sexting into this as something they should be thinking through in terms of consent, in terms of comfort, in terms of intimacy, in terms of privacy. When you're talking about all of those things, you want to talk that through with sexting. The other thing that's really important from the kid perspective is when we talk to them about this, typically, we tend to, it makes us nervous. We don't want them to do it, which 100% is right. And so we just say to them, and you tell that person no, right? Or like we say, something that tell them, I can't, that's so inappropriate, right? Something like that. And, the middle schoolers or, early high schoolers are like, I don't really think I can say that, right? Or maybe I could say that to some people, but I couldn't say that to everyone. And so it's really important that you talk through action plans for different scenarios. So what I mean by that is if it's a person they don't know well and they get something they don't feel comfortable with, kids are really good at being like, ew, gross, don't send that to me. It's much harder if it's someone you have a crush on. It's hard if it's a friend, right? If it's someone in your friend group, what do you do then, right? So helping them see through the different iterations of the ways this might play out is incredibly important because it isn't always so straightforward, right? Because then they go, wait, oh, it's a friend. Well, I don't want to ruin the friendship. So how could I handle it then? And helping them recognize a bunch of strategies. What you want them to do is leave that conversation being like, okay, actually, there's something in there that I feel like I could do. So the thing that might work for you is awesome to share. It gives them ideas. It might work for them, but it might not. So you might have to be open to, let's think of other things. Let's brainstorm this. You might even play it out. Like, imagine this happened. If that feels really uncomfortable and your kid is like, I can't do this with you right now, right? Which might happen. You always can take the approach that, I used to take in a middle school where I'd be like, I have a friend who, right. All you can, you can always say like, tell me about, like, do you ever hear people talking about this? How do they handle it? What do you think? What if someone did this? So you can make it more hypothetical if the conversation directly about them is feeling too close to home. But again, still working through those different iterations. If it's in your friend group, if it's someone, what if it's the quote cool kid, whoever that is? How do you handle that? Right? Thinking it through that lens. The other quick thing I just want to say about this, because it often is presented incorrectly. There's often a question about how this is gendered, and it is not gendered in any way. There is no difference between who sends things, who creates things, anything like that. And so we tend to have conversations with, male identifying kids as like, don't ask for them. And then we tend to, talk to, people who identify as female as, don't send them. And actually everyone should get both of those conversations. Everyone should get don't ask, don't send. There's no gendered component of this based on what we know of the broader data. Connected to this is even the harder one, which is access to pornography. As you all know, I don't need to tell you this, they're going through puberty in middle school in a world where porn is free and available on every device, right? And the sad reality for us is that there's no way we can totally just keep this from them if they have access to a device. There's definitely things we can do, but for this topic, I think the better thing to think about, instead of focusing so much on monitoring, which is totally important and you can do it, I think we still need to make sure we're having the conversations. And sometimes when people get very focused on monitoring, they forget about the conversations. And kids are going to see this whether they are Googling something for a class project. I mean, I had a kid a couple of years ago that told me, in sixth grade, he was in 11th or 12th grade, but he told me in sixth grade, he had to do a history project and Googled the Silk Road and clicked on the other Silk Road and didn't even know, like just totally unintentional. And it was just in Google, right? Like, so even if we have all the devices in the world, they're still going to see things. And so those conversations are incredibly important. Okay. So for kids right now, this is not every kid, but there is a group of kids who see pornography as how-to guides. Like they feel that they're not getting enough information from the adults. That's on us about what sex is, what sex should be. And so they're looking to porn for answers. That is not, I don't believe, and I hope this doesn't, contradict your values, but that wouldn't be where I would want my kids to go. Right. And so understanding that that's how they're seeing it means there's a role for us for conversations, right? We also want to talk to them about how this might impact their views of, and I just listed a couple here, but you could think of many, about dating, about intimacy, about what it means to be a partner, what consent can look like. All of those kinds of things are really important for us to tuck in the back of our minds. So if this feels like a hard one to tackle, I have a couple of ideas here. The first one is always with these hard topics, if you can start with a why question, right? So not saying, now we're going to talk about porn. Have you looked at it? Right? It's not going to go very well. If you can say things like, why do you think it's really popular right now? What do you think is going on? Right? Why do you think people are going there instead of talking to adults or talking to, right? Asking those kinds of questions can be really a helpful inroad, because again, you're just asking their opinions on things. The other two things you want to in this conversation kind of get across is that it's not real, right? The appearances of people, the experiences that they're projecting are not real. And it's really important that they understand that, because if this is their how-to guide, they often end up, quite honestly, with really horrible experiences later on because they just don't even know what to expect, right? So understanding how unrealistic this is. And connected to that is understanding that this presents intimacy as a performance. Right. And we really don't want kids to be thinking about that, whether it's privacy, intimacy, all of that kind of stuff. So thinking through all of that as a starting point, these conversations that I have in this fire drills category, they're not one and dones, right? These are not, we can talk about this once and check a box that we're done with this. Unfortunately, we have to keep revisiting this as they get older. But if you can start this conversation in middle school and show that you're open to it and show that you want to like be a part of this, of talking to them about this stuff, so that they can come to you if they're like, actually, that wasn't so awful if I really needed to talk. I think that's really an important first step. The other big thing that I definitely was seeing before, but is certainly heightened in the pandemic, is friends serving as counselors for each other, mental health counselors, I should say. And so what's happening here is that often kids are in middle school, they might be texting each other and someone might say something like, I can't get out of bed. Like, I'm so miserable. I'm so depressed. They might even use that word, right? Some kids will say like, haven't eaten since yesterday, right? And it's in the context of like all this back and forth banter, right? And it's often very confusing for a couple of reasons. One is the way kids present it, which they might sometimes like, throw that out there and then put like 3 like goofy face emojis, right? So the kid is like, wait, did you honestly not eat? Or, right? They're trying to figure that out. The other thing that's super confusing is that we have a cultural habit in America. I'm working on this. This is like one of my big pet peeves. We use mental health language in jest, right? People are like, oh my God, I just had a panic attack, right? This is so depressing. All of this kind of stuff. We like diagnose, I think I have ADHD. I think I have anxiety, right? We talk like this. And so when we do that, it's often very confusing for kids of like, wait, do you mean it? Or are you joking? Because we all know, right? All the things you tell them about texting and all the things, you can't read tone, you don't have the context, right? So all of that comes into play here. And the other thing that's really important is that they really don't understand. And so this is the fire drill conversation. They truly do not understand what the line is between being a really supportive and caring friend and being a counselor. Okay. So what they're saying to me is like, they get those texts and of course they, like we would want them to like tell an adult and immediately get help. Right. But what they're thinking is, oh my gosh, I have to be a good friend. So they go, I can't believe that's happening. Are you okay? And then it starts to go back and forth. Now, a little bit of this is fine. What though it tends to teeter to is kids who are relying, or the expectation is that they will rely on a friend. And so when I talk to kids who are on the other end of this, they'll say, I can't put my phone away because I'm their person. And if I put my phone down, they might need me, right? That is way too big for a kid to manage alone, right? It's not safe, first of all, for anyone, but it's also a huge burden to put on a kid. Okay. So having conversations about this distinction, it's really confusing. And also we're not going to have totally the same line on it, but helping them get some language around this of like, there is actually a difference between a mental health professional and a friend, right? And helping them start to see this and maybe give some examples like, what would you think of this? Would this be too much? Like if a friend, so examples I give kids sometimes. If a friend texts you 6 times a day, does that feel? And they're like, yeah, that's probably fine, whatever. And I'm like, okay, a friend that texts you 50 times, they're like, whoa, okay, well, if something really major was happening in their life, maybe that would make sense. But if that was pretty regular, that feels really too much. Okay, let's talk about that. Why is it too much, right? So giving them some like thinking about like, what's your line is really helpful. The other thing is if they find themselves in this role, helping them develop some language around it, whether they need to blame us and take breaks, right? And say, oh, a parent or guardian is taking my phone. I can't be on right now. I can't help, sorry, I'll be back in a couple hours, right? If they need to do that. Helping them recognize how to get help from a trusted adult is really important. And language like, which is a great book that came out a year or two ago, maybe you should talk to someone, right? Of like helping them start to give that language and use it can be really, really helpful. This is a really important topic that I feel like when I talk to kids about, this is probably the number one thing. And actually I should have added, I have friends here. This can play out with romantic partnerships as well, right? Of ending up in this counseling role. But this is the number one thing when I talk to kids about, and I can linger. I always have 2 kids inevitably in every group who want to stay and talk to me about their specific situation. So just wanted to mention that. The last thing of my hard categories is the thing that I was spending most of my research time leading up to the pandemic, which is on the amount of hate speech in the digital space. And I knew this was a thing. This has been a thing. It's not like it didn't exist before, but it has gotten to this extent of almost every conversation I was having in every focus group, hate speech was coming up in some capacity. So I decided a year, I can't even, it's like, feels like 7 years ago. I think it was probably 18 months ago that I decided that was going to be my research focus for the year. And I spent all of last school year up until the pandemic digging in on this in interviews and focus groups. So here's what I know. It is everywhere. It is in YouTube videos, it's memes, it's TikToks, it's texts, it's everywhere. But this is what's important. I think a lot of us might want to say things like, oh, it's horrible people on the internet, or it's, it's white nationalists, or it's, complete anti-Semites, whatever it is, we might want to think it's those people. It's also classmates and friends. And this is the part that is, again, not ranking, but it is incredibly painful for students. It often, especially when it is created or sent or shared by classmates and friends, can run the gamut from things that are overt hate speech, right? The use of the N-word in texts amongst kids, the use of no homo, right? Very, very common, to what they consider to be subtle jokes. Okay, and I have that word in quotation marks. That's their language, not mine. And that's what is worth digging into. So what is happening? Some white students will sort of brush this off when I talk to them about it. And they'll say things like, well, I know my friend and I know she's not racist, so she didn't mean that. Or I know my friend, I know she's not homophobic, so she didn't mean that. And they're just sort of writing it off. Like it was a mistake, that like, can't you take a joke, that kind of thing. Then there's another group of students who do see this as problematic, but feel reluctant to act. They don't, in middle school, one of the worst things you can be labeled is a snitch, and they're terrified to be labeled as a snitch. So that's one thing. So they worry that if they tell an adult, any adult, that it's going to, and this is their language, it's going to start a big thing, right? And I don't know if I want to start a big thing. I would like to talk to somebody about it, but I really don't want to start a big thing. That's how they always talk to me about it. And then the other group of kids who's reluctant to act in this scenario are kids who worry about being gaslit, right? They'll say, if I were to say something, the response I would get, like, let's say in a group text, if someone were to say, like, you crossed the line, like, that's not okay. They often will get the response of, what's like, relax, you can't take a joke. And it puts it back on the person, right? And then the kid, especially middle schoolers, especially around memes or something, they might be going, wait, did I miss it? Did I not understand? Like, do I not know the inside joke that this is connected to, right? And so there's that. Then they feel like they've been publicly embarrassed and they don't know what to say. Because when the person says, like, what's wrong with you? Relax, that kind of thing. It's like, what do I say to that, right? So those are their two concerns. There are a group of students, often I will be totally honest with you, it is the students who are the victim of the hate speech, who are on the receiving end of it, do speak up. But there are significant social consequences for being the person who speaks up, right, in the kid world. And so just recognizing sort of that's the dynamic that's at play. So what can you do? First of all, again, not a one-off conversation, but talk a lot about this. Talking about your values and expectations. Also really important for them to hear you talk about how hard it is to stand up for what's right. We want them to be good upstanders. I want them to be that too. I want them to stand up for themselves and for their peers, but we have to acknowledge that that can be hard sometimes. And just saying those words out loud, I think, can be really helpful. Again, having an action plan for what they consume, but also, so I think, again, back to that question of it's those people on the internet. Yes, we should definitely care about what they're looking at. We also need to talk about what they're creating and sharing and reposting, right? So kids will often, and here's the disconnect. This is a very, very common one. Kids will say, well, I know, you can't say those things, you can't, right? But then they'll post a TikTok video where they are lip syncing rap lyrics and in the video use the N-word. And then they post it. And they don't see a distinction between those things, right? So these are the conversations that are significantly lacking. And we're a real role for us. Certainly enlisting other adults for support, right? If you can, talk about this with the parents of your kids' friends and think about, how can you help each other in this? I had a situation this fall with, my son's text group, and there's a couple other parents in that, of kids, and they were all on the same page, and we saw it and we talked about it with them and we addressed it. We didn't all see it, right? It was just one person who saw it, one parent, right? But that can be really helpful. The other things you want to think about is certainly obviously educating yourself. But, if you think to yourself, like, gosh, I didn't even know people were lip syncing rap lyrics on TikTok. How would I even know that was happening, right? The number one thing you can do is ask them, right? So say, geez, I heard there's a lot of hate speech, right? I heard people are seeing that. Where do you think it's happening? Have you seen anything? Like, what does it look like? Right? They know about it even if they haven't seen it. And that can often be a great end to a conversation. There are certainly great nonprofit resources about this topic. But the other thing that I would say, as you're sort of like, if you're in the car or anything like that, again, harder in COVID times, but pay attention to offline behaviors, right? If you hear kids using, a slur in the car when you're driving to practice or you're driving to music, whatever it is, you are going to pretty much be certain that that's happening in the digital space, right? So paying attention to offline behaviors, language that they're using, and asking if they use a word you don't know, say, what does that mean, right? Like really following up on this. I want to make sure that I have time to answer all of your questions. I'd be happy to talk about this, things I mentioned, other things, but here's just a couple ways you can connect with me if you'd like to reach out. No. I struck you all with my brilliance. There's no question. It's like my classes. They're like, please stop talking.
Should we ask our questions or type them in the chat?
I can't see the chat, so I don't know if.
Okay.
Actually, I'm glad that you asked. Hi, I'm Karen Shannon, and I would be happy to moderate the questions right now, and I would encourage you to write them in the chat since there are so many of us here on this call. And we will be looking at the chat and then kind of summarizing for you and asking Dr. Walsh your questions. So we'll give you a couple of moments to let you do that. But while you're doing that, I just want to thank you, Dr. Walsh. That was tremendous. I was taking notes feverishly, and my children are not in middle school, so I can tell you that a lot of this still applies even after they get a little bit older. So thank you. That was tremendously helpful. And before we jump into the chat questions, I do want to suggest that those of you who had prepared questions during your registration for the event. Hopefully you've had them covered through Dr. Walsh's content tonight. If not, please feel free to put it in the chat for us, and we will do our best to get to as many of these questions as possible. So I think one of the first ones that I saw was, Dr. Walsh, can you provide some examples around externalizers? I think you referenced that a little earlier on about certain types of children who are externalizers.
Yeah, yes. And so great question. So, you know, there might be a kid who is just an externalizer. There might be kids who do a little of both, right? So it doesn't have to be one or the other. But externalizing behavior is the kid, you might have this. So I have an externalizer and I'm an internalizer. It's a really tough combo, I'll tell you at home, because what he wants to do is when things are hard for him, he wants to yell at me and put it all on me, right? It's dramatic, it's all on me. And then I'm trying to carry this load for him. Right. And then I get into my internalizing spiral where I'm like, oh my gosh, she's having such a hard time. This is so hard. And then, you know, an hour later when I, you know, will run into him in the kitchen, right, he's like, hey, what's up? And I'm like, what? How are you okay? And I've been worrying about all the things that were hard for you. Right. So I think the important thing for externalizers is that we want to validate the feelings that they're having, the insecurity, the anger, that can feel very appropriate, but we want to address the behavior, right? So the key thing is to say, like, again, that connecting and validating, like, this is so hard. I know you're having such a hard time right now, but we can't have this conversation when you're yelling at me, right? And that kind of thing. So sort of putting parameters around the behavior, but we don't want to put parameters around the emotions because we do want kids to actually feel like they can share that with us. That's really important. So thinking about it that way can be really helpful. Other kids, if you can't take it, if it's just too much and it gets you into a spiral, some other kids who are externalizers do really well with actually doing something physical to just get out that like feelings of aggression that they have. So they might do really well with moving. Some kids, you know, it can move, it can run the gamut. I've had kids that punch pillows, right? And that's totally fine. It might feel uncomfortable to us. It's totally fine. Other kids will tell me they put on their favorite song and, you know, have a dance party in their room for a couple minutes, right? That kind of thing can be really helpful if it feels like you can't take it on and you end up in an argument with them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question. It says, thank you for speaking with us. I heard you speak a few years back at Pollard. And my question is, now that we are all overloaded with screens, how have things changed?
Yeah, I think, I think hopefully that was clear from the beginning of the presentation. I think it's changed in that I think, I don't ever like to use the language silver lining in regards to this pandemic, but I think if there's anything good that's coming out of it from my perspective of working with kids on technology is that they are much more receptive to seeing the limitations of connecting digitally. So even with the groups I had today, they all said, I used to think it was so great, and it is still great, but I really see how much I need the face-to-face time with my friends. I really see how things are different. And so that might be an opportunity for some conversations if you feel like tech has been a major source of frustration in your family, to think about like how you might capitalize on that if you can get someone to admit that. I'm certainly feeling that myself. It's like I'm on Instagram and I'm like, I'm bored with myself on Instagram, right? And starting to feel some of those emotions and being willing to name them is pretty new for kids. With most adults, they always wanted to be like, it's awesome, it's awesome, it's awesome, right? All the time. And nope, I'm not going to hear you. I do think that has changed. I also think that internalizing the ruminating, I'm seeing a lot more of that, of kids who are just feeling insecure about friendships and are really digging in on things. And then other kids who are just digging in on current events, right? Who are really overwhelmed by the news and are just watching, looking, checking, all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of that cyclical rumination is, I think, always was there, but now is worse.
Thank you. Our next one is, what are the early signs of game addiction?
Yeah, so this one is tricky. My field just sort of goes back and forth on whether it's useful to call these things addictions. I think certainly there's been some debate. It's in the appendix of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, where they're sort of like, we know that's there and we haven't quite decided what we want to do with it. But I think, gaming is the one where people sort of tend to report the most problem with kids getting off, right? And a lot of that kind of stuff happening. I would say the concerns for me are not around gaming. I'm actually quite pro gaming for a variety of reasons, which I'd be happy to share. But the one thing you want to really be looking at with the gaming is that is the one where I talk to kids where they're like, yeah, I looked up, I started gaming at 8. I looked up and it was 1 a.m. and I hadn't eaten, I haven't moved, right? It really puts them in a zone. And that can become, sort of problematic. So looking at, the amount of time they're spending, if they have an opportunity to do something, now gaming can be very social, right? But if they have an opportunity to do something and they're always choosing to play a game, if they're always playing by themselves. And the other language that's really concerning for me around gaming is I'll talk to a group of kids who game who are like, I'm trying to get to the next level, I love it, or I'm playing with my friends and we're doing this, whatever it is. And then there's a group of kids who might describe it as like, it's just the chance to take a break from my life. And that kind of escapist language, again, once in a while, totally get it. But if that is continually the language they're using, warrants a follow-up conversation. Not because I think the gaming itself is problematic, but the gaming might be a form of like almost self-medication, right? As they're trying to gaming is the one thing where you have to be in the moment. You have to be so present to do it. And it really does allow you to forget about everything else. And again, in small doses, that can be okay. But if we're doing that consistently, there might be something underlying going on. So those are sort of the primers for me, but I'm not anti-gaming. And I actually think it gets a pretty bad rap that is undeserved. If you have a gamer in your life and you are wondering about this and what might be positive, I would definitely recommend Jane McGonigal's book, Super Better. I don't drink the Kool-Aid on the whole book. I very much appreciate the intro, and I think maybe the first couple chapters where she really lays it out. She takes it to an extreme that I can't totally get behind. But if you can, read excerpts of it, especially the first couple chapters, it really lays out the brain connections and all that kind of stuff in a really accessible way.
And just one more time, Dr. Walsh, that title is?
Super Better.
Super Better.
Yeah, it's Jane McGonigal. And you can definitely get it on Amazon. It's great. You can also follow her on Twitter. She posts some cool stuff.
All right, maybe we can put that in the chat if we have a chance. Okay, thank you. So speaking of gaming, we have another question from somebody who says, it's about limiting content on the issue of porn. How can we start the conversation? Porn is everywhere without actually making them search for it. Do you have any guides for content blockers? I tried to limit content and all I managed to do was prevent my oldest from connecting to his friends on Xbox Live. He literally tells his acquaintances, my mom broke my device.
That's awesome. Yes, I totally get it. Yeah, so I think your first point is spot on, right? I think many of us avoid this conversation because we think we're going to plant seeds with them of like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing. Now I'm going to go look, right? So what I really recommend is taking that approach of asking really open-ended questions with them, which will help you start the conversation, like I said, but also get at this point you have, which is, really sort of getting to know where they're at with this information, right? And so if they have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, that's a great start. Then you can frame it more as, okay, sometimes you might see things on the internet that make you feel, not great or make you really confused. When those things happen, let's talk about it. And then you set up that plan. If they say something like, I kind of know what you're talking about, I've heard that, and they're playing that, they're saying that, then you might have a different conversation. Like, okay, what have you heard, right? Tell me what you think, and really not telling them what's out there, really taking this as you want to present for these hard conversations. I would frame it as you're an anthropologist, which is super hard to do with your own kid, but pretend you're like Jane Goodall, right? And you're out there and you're just observing. You are making no value judgments in the first phase of this conversation. Because if you start essentially, right in with the lecture, they're going to zip it. and they're not going to tell you what's going on. So the longer you can say more, right? The classic, say more, tell me more. What else? What else is going on? What else should I be thinking about? You know, play dumb, whatever works. I'm incredibly good. It's a little bit disheartening. I'm incredibly good at playing dumb, I think, with kids. They really buy it, right? But it works incredibly well. They love to be experts. They never get to be experts on anything. They're experts on the digital space. So use that to your advantage. But again, that can help you figure out where they are. And I don't think you have to do this in one conversation. You can do it in one, gauge where they are, have some time to yourself, think it through. What do I actually want to say? And then come back later with the other conversation. You don't have to tie this up in a neat little bow. I actually think the more often you're willing to engage on it, the more likely they are to come to you. If we do the like, well, I covered that, right? They're then sort of forgetting. But if they're like, wow, she keeps talking about it, and like she's sort of okay in handling this, then they're more inclined to come back with more.
Great, thank you. Our next participant wants to know if these tips and suggestions apply to elementary age children.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the screen time stuff certainly applies to elementary school children. I think the fire drill, you know, it's so kid specific, right? I sometimes talk to, you know, I'll be in a school and maybe there's fifth graders and, you know, half the class has phones. And so they are in the texting world and there's the meanness and stuff like that going on. And other fifth graders are, you know, like so beautifully young, right? And like have no interest in this stuff, or maybe they're just playing roadblocks, right? And so it really runs the gamut in terms of that the later content from the talk. But I personally think the more conversations you can have around like, what's hard? What's going on? What are you seeing? Setting that framework up early and often, even when the hardest thing they're seeing is so-and-so lost at roadblocks, right? is still, it's valuable because it will pay dividends as you go on. It's so much harder on these topics to try at 17 and 18. Right, to change course. It still can be done. It can be done. It's just harder, right? So the more you set up is like, this is routine. We just talk about this at home, right? The better. So I think, again, developmentally appropriate, age appropriate, but starting these conversations early is a good thing.
Great, thank you. What special considerations would you have for parents who have children with ADHD?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, it's so challenging. I think this, you know, Zoom school and all this stuff, which while we're seeing there's some opportunities, some kids I talk to love it, right? And then other kids, it is a complete disaster, right? And thinking of all the ways in which technology can add so many layers of distraction. And in a situation where they're forced to be on the technology, it's really hard for kids. So I think for me around this topic, there's a real emphasis on the multitasking and a real emphasis. So having that conversation and really thinking through avoiding that because it can be so tempting. And then the other thing that's really important is that thinking about amount of time in one sitting and really making sure kids are getting breaks. I think that's true of all kids, but especially kids who have an ADHD diagnosis, making sure that they're not sitting still. Though, you know, I think the more they can do to move, even moving to different parts of the, you know, of the same room to take different classes can be incredibly helpful, right? Just being really creative about that is awesome. But it's an incredibly challenging time. So yes, I hear you. I do think there's some good resources out there. And I can actually, I can pull some of those and share those if you're able to share after for families right now going through pandemic remote learning with some of these considerations.
Thank you. I think we could probably make that happen. I think we'll be reaching out to people with our surveys. So yes, we can definitely do that. And by the way, I just want to mention just quickly here, we are putting a survey in the chat. So we would love it if you would take a few seconds to answer that quick few questions for us. We'll also be following it up in an email to you. All right, back to our questions. We have a parent who asked, sometimes kids wake up with 500 texts. They feel they have to respond or read them all. How would you suggest we handle that?
Yes, middle school texting. I love it. Okay, so yes. So there is definitely a, you know, it's kind of like a, I don't even know what you want to call it. It's like a hidden secret that they all feel like if they don't respond to text messages immediately, like truly immediately, they have signaled that they don't care about the friendship. Right now, we might think that's patently absurd, right? And my friends, I mean, there's some texts I'm like, did you text me 2 days ago? Right? And I can get away with that at my age, right? They really feel like, and especially during the pandemic when friendships maybe feel a little more insecure, they really feel like if I don't respond right away, this person will think I don't like them. Or, right, it feels like a zero-sum game. Either that or I might be out. Right? I might not be included next time. I might be taken off this, right? So again, this for me would be in the category of, we know they can't respond to or they shouldn't respond to 500 texts, right? They can't manage that. It's too much and they have other things they got to do. But we do need to validate and empathize with that need, because it's not just your child. That is sort of the norm. Now, we can do work with them of talking about like, it's not about, the number of texts you get and all that kind of stuff. We can have those conversations, but it's really important for them to hear from us. I find it so overwhelming when I have like 3 group texts going off at the same time, right? And just saying to them, I don't know how you even try to manage this. This must be so hard, right? And that, starting from that place and then saying things like, I know your friends really matter to you. What do you think we could do? How could we handle this? What could work? Do you want to try something? Or saying things like, you seem a little overwhelmed when you're trying to manage this, right? Really helping them recognize that, and maybe feeling like there's some group text where they can let it go a little bit. There's others they can't, right? And helping them navigate that. But it is definitely the reality. What I would love all of us to do is talk to them about how they don't actually have to reply to everything. This is sort of like semi-tangential to your question, but it's making me think of it. This thing that you're so clearly articulating in the question can also create another challenge when they experience some of those hard things that I was talking about at the end of the talk, because they feel the need to reply. And so because they have this mentality of, I always reply, I have to reply, I have to reply. Sometimes when it's something they know is not right, they still reply anyway, and then you can imagine it could egg it further and keep it going. And so having them, develop an understanding around you don't have to reply. B, that can be an awesome strategy for dealing with hard things, at least in the short term before you can get help. And really thinking that through, because it's a challenge for them. I will say it does get better. It doesn't necessarily go away for everyone, but it does get better. You are in the peak of it in middle school around this topic.
All right, thank you for that. When concerns get beyond what parents can handle, what is the best next step?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it, of course it depends, and I can't tell from the, specifics of that question what the challenges are, but I think there are so many incredible mental health professionals. We are so, it's like an embarrassment of riches in the Boston area, how many amazing people there are that can work with children. And I think reaching out, and even just the conversation of, this is what I'm seeing, what do you think? A lot of people that I'm talking to one-on-one with families are asking this question, which I think is so spot on right now, is like, how do I tell the difference between horrible pandemic living right now and my kid having a mental health problem? Right? Because I just said sadness is normal, all this, right? I was giving all those things, which it is. I want to normalize that. And yet there's really this lingering question, and a mental health professional can really help you distinguish between those, right? They'll have an understanding. You can give really specifics about your kids, right? To understand like, yeah, okay, that feels really normal, pandemic life. And wow, okay, what you're describing feels a little different. Or yes, it's both, right? It might be both. But I really would suggest reaching out to people. There are so many kids and families who try to manage this alone, and it can be done. And depending on the severity of the thing, it certainly can be managed. But I've truly never met a kid that, didn't, after receiving help, be like, wow, that helped a ton, right? Right. So I think it really can be, that can be the first best step. The other thing, if you don't feel comfortable jumping right there, is to reach out to someone at your kid's school, an adult that they're connected with, and find out what's going on at school. Sometimes the child presents quite differently to other adults than they do to you at home. That might be an externalizing kid, right? Who externalizes with you, but at school is super happy and, going along. So that can be another adult. Getting a different perspective on that can be a really helpful next step.
Great, thank you. What kind of feedback could you offer us on gaming as, I'm sorry, wait a minute, that just jumped. It's the thing about the chat. I'd like to hear some of your feedback on gaming for boys, as this is how they socialize, but also they can feel left out if they're not online playing all the time.
Yeah.
So ideas for boys.
Yeah, totally. So, you know, again, I hate to play into gender stereotypes, but the example of the text message, example of constantly needing to feel like they're responding and that kind of thing, that left out FOMO tends to typically maybe a little bit ish. I'm really hedging my bets because I hate playing the gender stereotypes, but happen a little bit more for girls. Whereas, you know, what you're describing is more the boy gaming experience is sort of the opportunity for them to socialize. And it has its own social pitfalls as well. Whether it's muting, whether it's not being on at the same time and feeling like you're constantly missing a friend. Other middle school boys will talk to me about like, you know, I get on and like 3 of them are already like Fortnite, 3 of them are already in a game. And so I can't just join in, but like, did they all know? Did they plan without me to meet up for the game? Right. And they start doing that kind of ruminating. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that these challenges around missing out, around feeling insecure about friendships, 100% happen for boys, right? It's totally important that we acknowledge that and talk to them about it. It is absolutely they're a place that boys love to socialize, and it really works well for them, and that's awesome. But having those conversations, like, what do you do when it gets hard? Like, how are you handling this? What do people do, right? I see it in my own son, right? If sometimes he'll go on and he's like, I'm going to see if any friends are on, and then I'll come down, you know, 10 minutes later, and he's like, no one was on. I guess I'll just play by myself, right? And it's so sad and defeating, right? Or he'll see like so-and-so's on, but they're playing with somebody else, right? And, you know, really having those conversations, like that can be hard. Like, feeling left out stinks. It is the thing, probably if you can remember middle school, it's probably the thing you remember most, right? I certainly do, of the times I was left out, right? Or walking around the lunchroom, like, where do I sit, right? Those are the 2 strongest memories I have. And so it is the time as they're jockeying for position in the social hierarchy. Middle school can be really tricky in that regard. So I think it's really, really important both to acknowledge the value of it as a social space, but also to talk with them about how some of the social challenges that can happen in live school, in texting, can also happen in gaming.
Okay, great. You have been wonderful answering all of these questions, Dr. Walsh. I think we have maybe just a couple minutes for a question or two, and our apologies if we don't get to every single question. We can try to follow up perhaps afterwards. But let me just see, I have one here. Is it ever effective to be punitive with screen use, i.e. they're on their phone late at night? Do we take it away, or is a conversation enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am totally for tech consequences for tech violations, if that makes sense. So if they break a tech rule, I think there should be a tech consequence for that. If they are mean to grandma, I don't think there should be a tech consequence. There can be a consequence. I'm not saying there shouldn't be a consequence, but it shouldn't be a tech consequence. We tend to want to go after tech because we think it's where it's going to hurt them the most, right? If any of you have done the threat where it's like, I will take away that phone for a year, and then you're like 2 years, right? And you just keep, because they don't seem to have the reaction you want, right? And so I think, it feels right to me, based on what we know about development and parenting and stuff like that, to have a tech consequence for a tech bad behavior, right? And so it's like, you violated the tech rules. So if it's, you stayed up way late and you were on your phone and you violated that, we know there's no phones after bedtime, then there's a tech consequence. And the way you can frame it to them around technology, I really love. It's hokey, so don't say this is where you got it, but it's from Brene Brown. I just want to not claim it as my own idea. She talks about trust as being like marbles in a jar, and you have to earn them or you lose them. And that's the idea that I like to frame with kids around tech, is this trust, right? Trust is not something you automatically have. It's not like you get the phone and I just trust that you're going to do it right? You earn my trust by following the rules and doing the right thing. And you can lose parts of my trust by violating those rules, right? Or behaving horribly in the digital space, right? And if they do those things, if they lose your trust, then it's appropriate to go, we have to rein in, because you're showing me that I can't trust you about that. right? And so I think that conversation is really valuable. Again, I just wouldn't extend it beyond tech unless, obviously you can do whatever you want. I just wouldn't make a continued practice of always using tech as the default for everything, because it sets up the oppositional thing of like, they love it, you hate it. They know you're going to take it away at any minute, so they're going to gorge on it any chance they get, right? And so it can just set up some unhealthy patterns around that. Having said that, I'm a parent, I'm a working mom during a pandemic. I've 100% taken the phone away and violated my own rules, right? I just try not to do it all the time.
Understood. Lord knows I've violated that one. I want to thank you for all of your thoughtful answers to these many questions. And again, we tried to get to just about every one of them. And if I could just make one last reminder, we have put the survey link in the chat. So we'd love it, even if you just want to open it up before you head out for the evening, and you can leave it on your desktop and finish it later. We'd love that. And somebody did want to know if we are recording this. We will be sending that out. And are we sending the slides too, or what was?
Yeah, I don't think I was going to share my slides, but you
No,
can see them probably
it's in the recording.
Right? Yeah.
There you go. So that takes care of that. So thank you again. We appreciate everything you've shared with us. I want to thank everybody who has come here tonight. And I also would like to extend another thank you to our co-hosts from the High Rock Pollard PTC, and to Beth Israel Leahy Health, and of course for the volunteers from the Substance Prevention Alliance of Needham, known as SPAN. Just a very quick plug. I'm respectful of everybody's time. To let you know, Needham Community Education is now offering Parent University with several online workshops around mental health for parents and students, and you can learn more and register on their website. That's at Needham Community Education. And SPAN is actually hosting an event next month on March 9th called Cannabis and the Teenage Brain. We'll be hosting that with Natick 180, our partners, our friends over at the Needham Public Health Department. And that's on Tuesday, March 9th. You can head to our website, spanneedham.org, to see more about that and to register. So did I miss anything, Alyssa? Anybody?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. So from all of us, Dr. Walsh, we thank you immensely. I hope everybody here was as equally enlightened as I was, and we appreciate taking the time to come here tonight to Needham. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Have a great night, everybody.